Okay, so now we are going to discuss today, like the new part of today's lesson is how to solve quadratics when they don't factor. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is something called the square root property. Now, I like to use the square root property the most when the middle term is missing. The middle term is otherwise known as b. And I've got that defined somewhere on the page, but when the middle term is missing, the square root property is my guy. And I'll show you why. So again, I want you to notice that it's degree 2, so I'm going to get 2 answers. So I should have maybe started off with an easy one, like if I told you x squared equals 25, a common mistake that people will make with the square root property is if I told you I'm thinking of a number and I squared it and I got 25, most people are like 5. And yeah, it could have been 5, but 5's not the only thing that I can square and get 25. Like, it is going to be positive 5 or negative 5. So we're going to write that as plus or minus 5. So that's 2 answers, positive 5 and then also negative 5. So let's do that here. So I'm going to add my 2. So that gives me 3x squared equals 2. And I'm going to divide by 3. So that gives me x squared equals 2/3. Now, what operation can I do that will undo a square? So what will undo a square is a square root. So the square and the square root cancel each other out, thus accomplishing the goal of getting the x by itself. And I'm left with plus or minus the square root of 2 over the square root of 3. So I have to rationalize. So I've got to multiply the top and bottom by the square root of 3. So that gives me plus or minus the square root of 6 over 3. Now, why are there 2 answers? There are 2 answers because there are 2 things that I can square that would give me 2/3. Just like there were 2 things I can square that would give me 25, there are 2 things I can square that would give me 2/3. So you just got to remember, every quadratic has 2 answers. So, all right, let's try that again. Now this guy, it says something squared. I'm just going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And the square and the square root cancel each other out, thus on the left side just giving me x minus 5. Now, if I squared something and got 4, that something could have been 2, but that something could have also been negative 2. So that's why we're going to put plus or minus 2. So what this means is that x minus 5 could equal 2, but it also means that x minus 5 could equal negative 2. So I add my 5, and that gives me 7 for an answer. And I add my 5, and that gives me 3 for an answer. Okay, now this guy, I get this guy is a little weird. But the bottom line is, I get that your instinct is to always set it equal to 0. But they're trying for you to see like, oh my gosh, this left side factors. And what gives me 25 in a middle term, a negative 10? Oh my gosh, minus 5, minus 5. Oh, it just happens to be x minus 5 squared. So basically, they gave you like this problem. They just didn't factor it for you, so it's a little goofier. Anyway, now we're going to take the square root of both sides. And the square root cancel each other out and gives me x minus 5. Now, unlike last time, the square root of 4 was 2. The square root of 12, we're going to say, is plus or minus 2 radical 3. And again, it's plus or minus because there's 2 things you can square that will give you 12. And so here, when you add your 5, you get an exact answer of x equaling 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Oh. Okay, so that's considered the exact answer. I can't go any further with that because they're not like terms. The approximate answer is where you say 5 plus 2 square root of 3. And so we'll say 8.46. And then we're going to say 5 minus 2 square root. Oh, press the wrong thing. 5 minus 2 square root of 3. And we have 1.54. So those are my two approximate answers. And the square root property is most useful when b is 0, or I will say when the middle term is missing. See how there was no middle term there? All right, so that's a look at the square root property. So I'm going to end this video here.